remember, and maybe this also harkens back to sermons in Genesis, do you remember when we took some detailed look at Eden, what we could know about Eden? Like, how should we think of the Garden of Eden? So we know it's a garden, but is that all that it seems to be when we observe some of the details? Here's some choices. Is it elevated above the lands around it? Which one way you know if there's an elevation change is water runs downhill. Are there rivers that we're told about in Eden, and do they run from Eden to other lands? There are, which would indicate Eden is what? It's a hill or a mountain. Was there any language? This is probably a little detailed question, so I would only expect you not to remember this. Was there any language used in the description of what Adam was to do in Eden that was priestly language? I know it is a garden, but what was he told to do to the garden? Do you remember? To tend and to keep. That same language was used, do you remember when we were looking at the instructions for the priests as they were to tend to the tabernacle? Same language. When we moved forward and we were able to see what did God do with Adam and Eve in the garden on a daily basis. We learned this in chapter 3. But what did Adam and Eve experience in the garden with God? Fellowship, his presence. He came and he walked with them in the garden. So communion or fellowship with God in his very presence. And then what did sin do as it pertains to the location of Adam and Eve in or outside of the garden? What did sin do? It removed them or exiled them. So when we then traveled and we saw that God then he made a promise to Abraham, which related to Abraham's descendants, that they would eventually become a great nation and they would be given a land that God promised to Abraham. And even though God reveals, we'll find this really quickly on Sunday mornings, God reveals that Abraham's descendants will be taken into exile, they will come back. And God exactly does what he says. And so we can remember that in the Torah, God takes Israel into Egypt, but then he brings them out through Moses. And as they come out from Moses, do they leave rich or poor? They live rich. With whose riches? The Egyptians' riches, which Egypt would be, in one sense, it's one of the nations, especially maybe even at that time, the preeminent or representative nation. And they leave with the riches of the nation to go where and to do what? To go to the land that God is giving them. And what will they do there? They will serve or worship God there. So that's why Moses told Pharaoh, let God's, Yahweh's people go. They have to go in to worship him. And so in doing that, he takes them, doesn't he, through the Red Sea, and there they go through, and judgment comes through the Red Sea to Pharaoh's army so that salvation comes through divine judgment. And then they wander through the wilderness, eventually under Joshua, entering into Canaan. But while in the wilderness, God reveals something to Moses, and that is there to build the tabernacle. And you can remember whose resources were used to build that tabernacle. Well, let's say it this way. Were they heavenly or spiritually resources, or were they actually physical resources on earth that were representing the the vision that Moses was given of what was in heaven? Was it physical, tangible, earthly? It was. And they made it. God gifted them with his spirit, but they made that tabernacle. And you might remember in the conclusion of the construction of the tabernacle and then its consecration, what was the grand blessing that came to Israel in the tabernacle? God's glory descended and filled the tabernacle. So that in this sense, we're able to see maybe like it was in a way in Eden, so it now is with Israel, that God dwells in the very center of the camp, and his visible majesty is seen filling the temple. We also could remember, and here's some, I think this is very helpful. What therefore is a temple? Both, we could say, in Eden and in the tabernacle. And then as we travel into the Solomonic temple, what is a temple? That's exactly right. It is the place where God's glory is present. It is the unique dwelling place for the visible majesty of God. And then what does a temple do? This is where, when we looked through, you might remember in Leviticus, especially considering the significance of the Day of Atonement. But what does the temple provide or do for God's people? This is what, remember, so much was related to the Day of Atonement. Since God is present among his people and he is holy, what does the temple also have to provide for God's people, since he, the Holy One, is present?
Place to atone for sin.
Which, and this is key, what does that atoning sacrifice in the temple provide for God's people with God? Fellowship or peace. Right? So this is significant as we're thinking about so much has centered upon a temple. And now we're going to go to yet another promise, and that is when God makes a covenant with David in 2 Samuel chapter 7, you might remember that what kind of house does God promise David's son will build? Is it a house for David or for David's king? Or is it a house for God? It's a house for God. It's a temple. But then he says a king is going to build this temple. How long will this king's rule reign? This king who builds a temple and will rule for how long? This Davidic son. Forever. Right. All of this is prior to what we're going to see in Haggai, and it is necessary for us to see the significance, or maybe remind us of the significance of what? A temple. A temple. And I would surely say that many evangelical Protestant Christians probably don't think about the significance of a temple when we consider our relationship with God today, or even the future that God's redemptive plan has for us. And that is, in one sense, it really reveals our ignorance of Scripture, because Scripture gives incredible emphasis to the place of a temple. And so Haggai is going to help us, although I'll just go ahead and confess, I've been challenged with really figuring out exactly how one of the promises in Haggai are to be fulfilled. But it's at least one of three options. So we'll go through those. A little bit of information about Haggai. Haggai is a contemporary with Zechariah. We will look to his book next week. He returns from exile in Babylon about 538 BC with about 50,000 other Jewish refugees, and they come back into Jerusalem. You can read about this in Ezra chapter 4, verse 24 and following. And this was because Cyrus, the king of Persia, rose to power in 50 BC and overthrew Babylon in 539. And then Cyrus, just as God promised or prophesied, he had an edict drawn up that sent a remnant of the Jewish exiles back to Israel. And Haggai was in that number. 15 years after they return, Haggai is commissioned by God to call the people to do what they were actually sent by God to do in the first place, and that is to refinish the temple. And so 4 years after the message, this temple was dedicated. You can read about that in Ezra chapter 6, verses 15 through 18. That being said, we're going to find out that I think that there's a lot of practical encouragement for us as we go through the book of Haggai, but at the same time, there's going to be some really significant prophetic elements to the book of Haggai, which indeed are very, very significant, even if I am not as certain on exactly how we are to understand their fulfillment. So let's move forward. There's 4 oracles. One commentator had 5, but it seems that there is most agreement that there are four oracles in the book of Haggai, and so we'll work through the book with those 4 oracles. Now, Luke, what an oracle is just a message that is being announced about what is coming. So you could sort of think of it as like a prophetic sermon in one sense that is given to a people. And so the first one comes in the first 11 verses of Haggai. And we're going to see that what Haggai is first going to announce, that there are different circumstances that now define this remnant, these returned exiles. They're in different circumstances now that they're in the land, but it doesn't seem that they have a different heart. Right? So let's consider, I know we've done some of review. How significant is the land for Israel to understand God's faithfulness to his covenant promises? Is it A, insignificant, B, sort of significant, hit or miss, you could take it or leave it, it's not a bad thing, or is it C, absolutely essential? Luke, which one? C. It's absolutely essential that they go back to the land. You may remember that when they were exiled from the land by Babylon, one of the things the Babylonians did when they took over the land is they destroyed the temple. So here's the second question. How significant is the temple to God's faithfulness? Is the temple, is it A, absolutely insignificant, B, sort of take it or leave it, or is it C, absolutely essential? Luke, take a guess. C. Sounds like I'm AI. Always guess C, right? It's absolutely essential. All right. So here, when they come back into the land, they're back in the land, but what do they not have? They do not have a temple. Add to that, what do we know from the Davidic covenant that we have expectations for what kind of king? A forever Davidic king. But at least we are thinking there needs to be a son of David who will be king in Jerusalem. And that Davidic king and his Davidic kingdom, what does it need to have with it or accompany it? A house for God, a temple. And ultimately, for God to do what God has promised to do, who needs to show up in that temple? God. Right? So In that sense, when we talk about going back into the land, look at verse 1. In the second year of Darius the king, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of Yahweh came by the hand of Haggai the prophet to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehoizadak, the high priest, saying, Thus says Yahweh of hosts, this people says, the time has not come, even the time for the house of Yahweh to be rebuilt. Then the word of Yahweh came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to live in your paneled houses while this house lies waste? So now, thus says Yahweh of hosts, set your heart to consider your ways. You have sown much, but bring in little. You eat, but there is not enough to be satisfied. You drink, but there is not enough to become drunk. You put on clothing, but no one is warm enough. And he who earns wages to put into bags with a bag with holes. Thus says Yahweh of hosts, set your heart to consider your ways. Go up to the mountains and bring wood and rebuild the house of God, that I may be pleased with it and be glorified. Says Yahweh, you look for much, but behold, it comes to little, and you bring it home, and I blow it away. Why, declares Yahweh of hosts? Because of my house which lies waste, while each of you runs to his own house. Therefore, because of you, the sky has restrained its dew, and the earth has restrained its produce. And I called for a drought on the land, on the mountains, on the grain, on the new wine, on the oil, on what the ground brings forth, on men, on cattle, and on all the labor of your hands. Right? So maybe you can put together the pieces, but here in the first oracle, we are able to see, though they have returned to the land, what have they neglected to do? It's a real class with real questions. I know my voice may sound like I'm preaching, but um, I don't know how to change that. How do teachers sound? They kind of talk with higher pitch. Other people like their voices go up when they talk. Mine like goes down. So I have no idea how to talk like a Californian. Hey, what do you think they failed to do? I don't, how do Californians talk, thing? Not like that. They failed to rebuild the temple. They failed to rebuild the temple. How does God judge this? Like literally, what was the judgment of God on the exiles in Babylon? That's right. When it comes to the agricultural production of the land, it is not yielding for them. And so we are able to learn that indeed the reason that the land did not yield much is because they did not bring up from the land what was required to rebuild the temple. Now, Haggai it's written in prose as opposed to some of really most of the other minor prophets. They're poetic, but he's got still like all of the great sort of preacher devices. So there's a number of play on words that Haggai uses in this section, but all of it is making this powerful point. The reason you don't have anything is because you didn't give to God's house what God put you there to do. That's why. Which enables us to understand a few things that I think is very, very helpful when we think about what is God interested in our life. So Luke and Kinsey, you haven't been here for much of the classes, but I'm very clear about who are my favorite students. My favorite students are those who are young. So you get to now join the group of my favorite students. And so here's one of the lessons for all of us, but especially I want my favorite students to hear. What do you think God considers to be most important in your life? And here we learn the worship of God and devotion to his glory is the most important thing in your life. It happens to be the most important thing in the world. And we're even going to see it is the most important thing in human history. And when these exiles returned to Jerusalem, the fact that they did not give themselves to the rebuilding of the temple, what does that reveal about their hearts? If they were paneling their houses instead of rebuilding the temple, what was a higher priority? The glory of God in the temple or their desires? Like for their own lives, for their own houses. Those are the two choices. Haggai brings that out when he's talking about their house in comparison to God's house. They were more concerned about themselves. Now, in that sense, I think probably all of us are able to think you don't have to be a Babylonian exile returning to the land to find that to be one of the things that you are going to battle with. That happens for Christians everywhere today. Let me just ask you, even as you consider your circumstances, what are you most interested in? Are you interested in God's glory in your life? Or do you sort of think about what God really needs to do is so enable you to achieve your desires? If you're doing, you need to understand that is sin. And here God visited that kind of attitude among these returned exiles with his judgment. And so they had different circumstances. They were in the land, but indeed their heart was not the same. And so it gave no fruit. In verses 12 through 15, we find the first narrative that follows this oracle, and it is addressed to two leaders, Zerubbabel and Joshua. Now, Joshua is the high priest. Zerubbabel, we'll consider him, and we'll find out later, he is significant because of who he is from. But we are told here that he has the position of governor, ruler. And Haggai now narrates, then Zerubbabel and the son of Shealtiel and Joshua the son of Jehozadak the high priest, with all the remnant of the people, listened to the voice of Yahweh their God and the words of Haggai the prophet, as Yahweh their God had sent him. And the people feared Yahweh. So, what were the two key things that they did in response to Haggai's message? They listened and they feared Yahweh. That's the age old plan that God has to correct his people. He sends his messenger who proclaims his message, and they hear and fear. 13. And Haggai, the messenger of Yahweh, spoke by the commissioned message of Yahweh to the people, saying, I am with you, declares the Lord. So Yahweh stirred up the spirit of Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and the spirit of Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and the spirit of the remnant of all the people. And they came and did work on the house of Yahweh of hosts, their God, on the 24th day of the 6th month in the 2nd year of Darius the king. So, messenger proclaims the message. He is heard or listened to. They now fear Yahweh. And how does Yahweh respond? Verse 13. He blesses them with his what? His presence. Even though there is no temple, God now responds to this favorable response of his people in light of the message of correction, and he promises, I am with you. Here, what we are able to see, how does the faithfulness of God to his covenant promises and his redemptive plan work even in spite of the sins and failures of his people? How does the covenant faithfulness of God and his promises work in spite of the sins and failures of his people? Here's your choices. He fails or he triumphs. He triumphs. He triumphs. Now, does he triumph because it doesn't really matter what they do, or does he triumph because he works in them? What do we see Yahweh doing, stirring up in verse 14? That's right. And so that by Yahweh stirring up the spirit, and that is of everybody, that is of the governor, that is of the high priest, and that is of the remnant, the people. He stirs in all of their spirit such that now what do? They came and did the work on the house of Yahweh of hosts, their God. Now, this is where the theology of Haggai helps to answer some of the questions that we often wonder. And that is, all right, if God calls me to do something, such as, let's just say, repent and believe, who's doing that? How would you answer that question from Haggai chapter 1, verse 14? Is that all you would say? What did Yahweh call them to do? And who did it? He called them to rebuild the temple. Who started rebuilding the temple in verse 14? Yeah, they did. They did it. So you'd have to add more to that answer thing. So God stirs in their spirit, but they are the ones who do the work. So if you, in that sense, you create this theological question. So in these exiles, spirit and body, who did the work to bring them to begin rebuilding the temple? God stirred in them so that they did what God commands. I would just say that in one sense, John Piper's sort of essence of Calvinism is God demands of us what he provides for us. God demands of these returning exiles to rebuild the temple, though they themselves have indeed been giving themselves over to their desires and neglecting God's command. He sends Haggai. Haggai announces this message. They listen, they fear Yahweh. Yahweh stirs in their spirits, and then they do what Yahweh commands them to do. That's how God works. That's how God works. I would even say to you, when you think about coming to church on Sunday, what happens when you don't feel like coming to church on Sunday? What might you understand about coming to church?
Similar to building a temple.
Yeah, maybe God will stir in your spirit, right? I think what we need to learn from this, and you see this in the New Testament, I would even hold up Hebrews as the most glorious example of this. When God's messenger brings God's message to us, God's Spirit uses to stir in us faith and obedience. So when you don't feel like doing what God commands you to do, one of the things that we learn we most need is I need God's messenger to herald God's message to me. Does that make sense? So the last thing that these exiles needed as they returned to the land and neglected what God commanded them to do for 14 years is to go on the basis of their feelings. Verse 2 might indicate what were their feelings. The time has not come. That means it just didn't seem like the time was right. That's why they didn't rebuild God's house. That's not how you approach obedience to God's commands. So this is one of the things we learn. So this is how God is working in the first oracle, and here how he stirs. And in the second oracle, chapter 2, the first 9 verses, we're able to hear of a new message. On the 21st of the 7th month, the word of Yahweh came by the hand of Haggai, the prophet, saying, "Speak now to Zerubbabel, the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people, saying, Who among you remains who saw this house in its former glory? And how do you see it now? Does it not seem like nothing to your eyes?" That would have been 66 years ago. That temple Solomon built was destroyed by the Babylonians when they came in. And so now Haggai is called to ask, and maybe Haggai is even in that number who saw it. How does this house compare to that house? Which one is more glorious? Verse 4. But now be strong, Zerubbabel, declares Yahweh. Be strong also, Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. And all you people of the land, be strong, declares Yahweh, and work, for I am with you, declares Yahweh of hosts. As for the promise which I cut with you when you came out of Egypt, my spirit is standing in your midst. Do not fear. For thus says Yahweh of hosts, once more in a little while, I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth, the sea also, and the dry land, and I will shake all the nations, and they will come with desirable things, the desirable things of all nations, and I will fill this house with glory, declares Yahweh of hosts. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares Yahweh of hosts. The latter glory of this house will be greater than the former, says Yahweh of hosts. And in this place I will give peace, declares Yahweh of hosts. What is this oracle revealing? Here's your choices: a past glorious temple, a present glorious temple, or a future glorious temple. A future glorious temple, but it's using both the temple that they're building at present and the past temple that Solomon built to point to this future temple. Now, it's easy to read this, but I find it to be challenging to understand how this is fulfilled. So we'll have to get into some of the technicalities in this passage. But clearly, we see that a future temple is said to be built in verses 6 through 9 that is going to be more glorious than the temple Solomon built. At the same time, what we learn in verse 3 is the temple that they've already started building, is it more or less glorious than Solomon's temple? Less glorious. So what that enables us to do is to understand this indeed is a future temple. Now, the consequence of that, we are able to see. If you came back into the land and you were recalling Solomon's temple and you're looking at this temple in front of you, and Solomon's temple was so much greater than this temple, how would you respond? For real, you just like, there's not, like just throw out answers. Let me give you multiple choices. You would be discouraged, despondent even. And thus, Yahweh anticipates that, doesn't he? It's almost as if Yahweh knows that that would be their response. And so, what does he have Haggai say to both the governor and the high priest and the people? Be strong, be strong, be strong. And then he tells them that I am with you, the end of verse 4, and then harkens back in verse 5 to the covenant, i.e., it's called the promise, which I cut with you when you came out of Egypt. My spirit is standing in your midst. Do not fear. So, though there is this lesser temple, is God's spirit still promised to be present with these returned exiles? Yes. And that is their assurance. The presence of God is their comfort and assurance that God is going to fulfill his promise. Now, we then get into verses 6 through 9, and this is where at least I think it gets tricky. I'll show you why I think it gets to be a little bit tricky. But one, we need to make a few other observations in the second oracle, and then see the significance of what we're thinking about with this future temple. We are able to see in verse 2 that this second oracle is addressed to Zerubbabel and Joshua and to the remnant. Now, we have been told repeatedly who is Zerubbabel the son of. This Shealtiel. Now, the name probably doesn't strike you or me immediately, but we learn in Second Chronicles that this is in the Davidic line. That means that Zerubbabel is, in that sense, a son of David, and he's governor of Judah, which you could say looks like he's a king. At the same time, we also are able to see what is the position of Joshua, high priest. So we have a Davidic, in that sense, potential king. We have an actual high priest, and we have a temple that has been at least begun to be rebuilt. In light of the covenant God makes with David, and also knowing the covenant that God has promised to Abraham and how the channel of Israel brings forth its fulfillment, what would you imagine the expectation to be? Like it's kind of like a prophetic, chemical reaction here. We got a Davidic son, we have a high priest, we have a temple, we're in Jerusalem. The age of Messiah, that messianic Davidic kingdom, like it could be now. And then you hit, well, look at it. This is not close to what Solomon built. And so this despondency is not just because of the architecture of this temple pales in comparison to Solomon's. It's also because that's what happens even when you are anticipating maybe the Davidic kingdom is about to break in. So this is like way more of a downer than just bad architecture. And yet God promises that he will be with them, do not fear. And then he does point them to the future. And this is their hope as they are doing the work that he commands them to do, even though they see that it's not what it once was. And he points to the future. And notice what he says. Verse 6 says, in a little while, once more. Now, the Hebrew commentators, some of them say this in a little while seems as if the expectation is it should be fulfilled near to when Haggai announced it. There's debate about that. I don't think that that's really the game changer and how we have to interpret that, but clearly it is in the future. Number two, what are the events that happen in conjunction with this future house that God is going to build? Verse 6. What happens? What does Yahweh do?
He will fill the house with glory.
All right, in verse 6.
creation.
Yeah, shaking heavens and earth, the sea and the dry land. In that sense, it's sort of like the flood. It is also like the Exodus. Yahweh is going to do something that is going to be like this dramatic reversal of the whole world order. And then we see in verse 7, he's going to also shake the nations. And what comes from God, Yahweh shaking the nations? These desirable things. The desirable things is what the Legacy Standard Bible translates it. And it's of all nations. And then we read, and I will fill this house with glory, says Yahweh of hosts. So this is clearly through Haggai speaking to Zerubbabel and Joshua and the people. Yahweh is promising to build another temple in the future from him shaking all creation and the nations. Now, thus, what do we clearly expect to happen in order for this temple to be built? What kind of upheaval has to be associated with the building of this temple? Worldwide, all nations are being totally reconfigured by Yahweh. And from that, these the desirable things come from the nations, and they are what verse 8 says. They are Yahweh's. The silver is mine, the gold is mine. And that is what is going to fill the house of Yahweh's glory. It's coming from the nation. So here's the hiccup. Many have interpreted the particular, in English, 3 words, the desirable things, to maybe your translation says the desirer or desired. Does your translation say that? Okay, well, here's what one has to decide. If you have here the verb is plural, the noun, the subject is singular. So you have to get into Hebrew grammar. And so it seems as if it's possible that it could be referring to something singular, that is the desire of all nations. But it is normally the case that the verb is going to now inform you that the subject, though it is singular, is actually referring to something in the singular that is a collective. But you can see how, okay, that's kind of hard. There's some struggle with what is intended there. So for those who interpret the subject to indeed to be singular, the desired of all nations, they see it as a messianic prophecy, that it actually is the Messiah is the desired of all nations. Now, that's very attractive, hopefully, to all of us, because we're always attracted to messianic promises in the Old Testament. And that may be what it refers to. I think I understand that when the Legacy Standard translates it, the desired things, notice that that's now the subject is plural. Of all nations, it indicates that it's actually referring to what in context also makes more sense. It is the riches of the nations. In verse 8, referred to as the silver and the gold of Yahweh. And you remember just in front of it in verse 5, Yahweh has alluded to the promise that he cut when Israel came out of Egypt. And what did they come out of Egypt with? The riches of Egypt. So I do think that it seems as if it is plural. And so therefore it is referring to the riches of the nations. And Yahweh's promise that there is a future house of his glory that will include or will receive all of the desirable things of all nations. And they're actually his to begin with, verse 8. And then he says, verse 9, when you compare that future house of Yahweh's glory with Solomon's old temple, it will be greater than the former. And then notice the last part of verse 9. And in this place I will give peace. So, what does that future temple provide for God's people? Peace. Remember what temples do? Temples are the place where indeed God, Yahweh's majestic glory is present, but they provide peace for God's people. Yahweh promises to do that. Now, there's a lot of practical benefits from thinking when one is despondent, disappointed, and how God's providence falls to you in God's redemptive plan. You can look to this passage and be able to see that there are some promises that you could be greatly encouraged by. One commentator noted 3. God promises in this future temple that he will richly adorn it. God promises that he will also have his real presence in it. And God also promises that he will provide you with real peace. Related to this vision, you are able to see that implicitly we have to trust in this promise. We have to have faith. And then we will see that there's a command, and that is we're going to actually have to obey in trusting in what God provides in this. And herein, I do think there's some value just to consider how faith works. If you are despondent with how God's providence falls to you, in light of his promises, you need to be able to look at what he indeed has announced, though it will come to you in the future, and you need to have faith in what God promises. Faith believes that the Lord's assessment of the situation is more true than your assessment of the situation. If these exiles were assessing the situation and they were despondent, and they went to Haggai and said, Haggai, I'm despondent. Look at it. Look at our fields. Look at our vineyards. Look at our orchards. This is nothing but depressing. And Haggai says, it's because you're not having faith in what God has promised in this future temple that he will do, and the promise that he is present with us. Humans see an unattainable past and a hopeless present when the Lord sees his own presence, his covenanted word of blessing, and his spirit. When you have faith, you affirm what God sees about the situation, not what you see. Does that make sense? You see how that fits for these exiles hearing Haggai's announcement of this future temple? So we could say that therefore this remnant now needed to beware of sort of listening to their eyes, but instead they need to listen to God's message with their ears. Despondency says, I can't do it. I can't see how, so I won't. Faith says, I can't see it, can't do it, but God can, so I will. That would, in one sense, be the way in which, when you read the first 9 verses of chapter 2 in Haggai, you can see some practical benefits of this vision of the future temple that Yahweh says he will bring the desired things of the nations to fill this house with his glory. Now, the challenge that we have here is, as it is described in verses 6, 7, 8, and 9, this never happened. Right? The nations were not shook. The world, in that sense, was not just rearranged through like natural disaster, but even like a rearranging of the nations such that they came into a second temple. Herod's temple really have this done. Maybe you could really stretch and say there were little reflections of this in Herod's temple, but you do not find this fulfilled in any temporal way in the near future to Haggai, or even in what's called Second Temple Judaism from the temple Herod built. So therefore, I think we have to conclude this has not yet happened. Which now leaves us with, okay, what is this referring to? Now, you got three choices. And it's not just a choice, right? You need to find from scripture the reasons for making one of these three choices. So I think all three of these are reasonable, but I don't think you would select them for the same reasons. One, what we are able to see very clearly is that when Jesus shows up in his messianic ministry, does he announce that his body is the temple? Yeah, got him in a lot of trouble, namely like he was crucified. Like one of the things that the Jews used in bringing Jesus to capital crime was that Jesus said that he was going to destroy the temple and raise it up in 3 days. And he was referring to his body. So Jesus himself referred to his own body as the incarnate Son of God in his messianic ministry to be the temple. And so that could be one of the ways in which we could see that this promise is fulfilled. And there are things related to the incarnation, the messianic ministry, and the second coming of Christ that is going to have like a cosmic shaking, if you will. And indeed, related to Jesus's coming, we are able to see in Mark chapter 1, verse 10, Mark chapter 15, verse 38, Matthew chapter 27, verse 51, that in Jesus's arrival, in his ministry, in his death, and his resurrection, there is cosmic upheaval. We also are able to know with Jesus's second coming, and we can read about that judgment which is to come, and we are able to see that there is going to be a massive judgment of the nations. But we're also able to see that in between the first and second coming of Jesus, in Acts chapter 15, verses 13 through 19, the Gentiles coming to faith are in one sense considered like a train of his own coming to him. So it clearly is not a literal temple if that is what is intended, and that makes it a little difficult here. But some of even the Old Testament commentators think that, similar to their interpretation of Ezekiel, that what Haggai is referring to here is this metaphorical temple that is indicating God's perfect dwelling among his people, which is fulfilled in the incarnate Son of God, Jesus the Messiah, in the Davidic messianic kingdom that he brings ultimately in his second coming. There's reason to think that might be it. But it is also true that it could be that there is a literal temple in the millennial kingdom, and that this prophecy is referring to that. And when you read Ezekiel chapter 40 through 48, and when you are able to also see what is referred to in Revelation chapter 20, it may be that a literal temple in Jerusalem is built, and this is fulfilled there. There's a number of interpreters who think that is the way that this is fulfilled. I don't know, and it's just because I need more time. More time. I think for different reasons, both are possible. But clearly, there's some challenges to the way in which would Haggai himself be thinking in commanding for them to build a physical temple, that a future non-physical temple is what God is seeing. that to me is a little bit of a struggle right now of seeing that in Haggai. So I have challenges with the logic of Hebrews to be able to think of the temple in the way Ezekiel describes it as being fulfilled literally, and at the same time, I have to say that Ezekiel does seem to clearly be talking about what seems to be a literal temple. Um, so I don't know. It either is a literal temple in the Messianic kingdom, or it is referring to the Messianic kingdom, which comes in Jesus's body and his first and second coming, or it could be this idealized kind of metaphorical perfect dwelling place that God will bring in the new heavens and the new earth. Those are kind of your three options. They're sort of chosen for different reasons. People are persuaded for different reasons. But as we go forward, what we're able to see is that this is promised, and another word is given. A future blessing is promised in verses 10 through 19. And so 3 months after they begin the work, God now promises a renewed blessing. And that is because they have responded to Haggai's message and that they have begun rebuilding and they are obeying. In verses 18 and 19, we are able to see that God promises a blessing to them. Oh, set your heart to consider from this day onward, from the 24th day of the 9th month, from the day when the temple of Yahweh was founded, set your heart to consider, is the seed still in the barn, even including the vine, the fig tree, the pomegranate, and the olive tree? It has not borne fruit, yet from this day I will bless you. So, in one sense, they are clearly seeing things aren't what they hope them to be. And yet, because they have chosen to begin rebuilding, they've responded favorably to God's word through Haggai. Yahweh gives them a blessing in verse 19. And then the last section is a promise about this future Davidic king. Then the word of Yahweh came a second time to Haggai on the 24th day of the month, saying, Speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I'm going to shake the heavens and the earth, and I will overthrow the thrones and kingdoms and destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations, and I will overthrow the chariots and their riders, and the horses and their riders will go down, every one by the sword of another. On that day, declares Yahweh of hosts, I will take you, Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, my servant, declares Yahweh, and I will make you like a signet ring, for I have chosen you, declares Yahweh of hosts. Now, clearly, we're able to see Zerubbabel is governor of Judah, and he is in Jerusalem, the city of David, and he is a son of David. And notice in verse 22, what does Yahweh promise to do to all the nations and kingdoms of the world, and to put under Zerubbabel? I'm sorry, I said it. It's to put under. Yahweh promises to overthrow them. And then what does he say Zerubbabel will be like in relationship to all of the nations from Jerusalem? A signet ring, right? So it's lost on us today. But if you were given the king's signet ring, then everything you could stamp with that signature, if you will, that imprint of the king's signet ring, it carried that authority. You were, in that sense, the king who stood in for the authority of God. You were his servant. You therefore had his authority and you ruled for him on the earth. Where is he ruling for Yahweh? Or from where is he ruling? Jerusalem, in Judah. as a son of David. And who is he ruling over? All nations. And so clearly we're able to see, is this a Davidic king? Yes. Is this a Davidic kingdom that is over all nations? Yes. And who has put him there? Yahweh. Now here's the other hiccup. This hasn't happened. Zerubbabel never came to rule over all nations in this manner. So we therefore rightly understand. So what then must Zerubbabel be? Zerubbabel is in one sense like this vision Haggai had of this temple. There is a way in which I do think that the right interpretation of the temple and Zerubbabel, they need to mirror one another or reflect one another. And so here I think we need to understand that Zerubbabel stands in as a type, if you will, of what God is doing in that final and forever Davidic king who will rule over all nations from Jerusalem with that signet ring of Yahweh. And that's Jesus, the son of David, the King of kings and Lord of lords. I think this is fulfilled when he returns. I think it literally is going to be absolutely manifest and physical in the millennial kingdom. And that is when Jesus returns, he will from Jerusalem rule over all the earth and all nations. And that is when this will be fulfilled. And Zerubbabel was a type to show us what to expect God to do through Jesus when he returns in the millennial reign. I therefore tend to locate the temple to also be associated in some form or fashion with that same reign of Jesus, whether it is a literal temple or whether it is figuratively speaking of what Jesus's reign will bring. So there's some, I'm not quite certain about how that works out yet. So that's Haggai. Questions or comments, Tim?
So with the last prophecy, talks about if I'm Zerubbabel and I hear Haggai say, "Going to take you," says Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, and I'm thinking my anticipation of Zerubbabel that I get to the end of my life and I see I'm going to die, that I'm going to be resurrected by God.
You know, I didn't read anything of that, but at the same time, I only read 4 commentaries, so I wouldn't act like I have read wide enough to really accurately comment on the body of literature that might interact with that. That's a good question. All right, here's one thing for us to indeed, I think, take away. When you think about the true essence of faith, what our faith rests in is what God has promised. And in that sense, it's what through our ears we see. Faith does not rest in what we see. And here you're clearly able to see that when it comes to the blessing of God through Haggai on these remnant people as they've returned. They have to indeed see through their ears what God has promised and not through what they see in their present circumstances. And Jesus, I think, is very clearly this Davidic king who is returning to reign. And we will one day see it with our eyes. Right now, we see it through our ears. Y'all are dismissed.